Welcome, Nyajong. Welcome to NPR's In Focus, Equity in Education. My name is Ga Va, and I'm the Director of Community Engagement and Impact for Minnesota Public Radio. In Focus is a series of convening NPR is committed to leading over the next year to bring awareness, dialogue, and potential community solutions to Minnesota's persistent racial disparities. We hope these conversations with community leaders that are shaped by curious and engaged audience will encourage new connections, new relationships, and help Minnesota communities make progress towards equity and inclusion. We value your opinion. If you registered for this convening through Zoom, you will receive a survey. Please complete the survey. Your opinion about today's convening matters to us. Before I introduce Angela Davis, who will be your host for tonight, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge that we're on Indigenous land, and to acknowledge Indigenous land is to give thanks to those who share their land with us. Now I'd like to introduce Angela Davis. Angela will host tonight's conversation. She is a longtime Twin Cities news anchor and reporter. She hosts Minnesota Public Radio's News's 11 a.m. program, focusing on important issues that impact Minnesota. Angela, over to you.
Thank you so much, Guy. And hello, everybody. We're all here this evening because we all share an interest in children here in Minnesota and their education. And we want to learn more about equity in education and how to attain it. It's my hope that all of us will learn something new tonight about what educators and students and parents and researchers are seeing, and that we will walk away from the discussion this evening with some new passion, inspired to see some change in what has been a persistent problem here in Minnesota for way too long. I will be asking some of the questions that you all submitted when you registered, and I'll tell you there were hundreds of them. We can't get to all of them, but the producers at NPR and we will be keeping an eye on the chat messages that come in as well during the discussion, and try to get in as many questions as we possibly can. For questions that we can't get to, I'll remind you, I do have a talk show at 11 a.m. Here on NPR, and we talk about education quite a bit. And so we will continue to do so as this pandemic continues to pose so many challenges to schools and families. So we will use many of your questions as ideas for future talk shows. So let's get started with the discussion. I have several great guests, and I want to introduce them to you right now. And you can see them joining us now as they start to turn their cameras on. We have with us Anusha Nath. Anusha is a research economist for the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, which has been studying racial disparities in education in Minnesota. Hello, Anusha.
Thanks, Angela. Thanks for having me here.
Nice to see you. We also have with us Michael Walker. Michael is the Director of Black Student Achievement for Minneapolis Public Schools. Hi, Michael.
Hello, how you doing? Good evening, everyone.
Hi, doing well. Also, we have Ramona Quito Stately joining us, and Ramona is an Indigenous culture and language educator, as well as an activist with We Are Still Here, Minnesota. Hi, Ramona.
Good evening. Thank you for having me, Angela.
Good to see you. And we have Samantha Diaz joining us. Samantha is the Legislative and Policy Director in Education for Minnesota Council on Latino Affairs. Hi, Samantha.
Good evening, Angela. Thank you for having me.
Good to see you. And also joining us, we have Jess Davis. And Jess is a racial equity coach for St. Louis Park Public Schools, as well as a former Minnesota Teacher of the Year. Hello, Jess.
Good to see you, Angela.
All right. Thank you for your time. And Anusha, I'm going to ask you to get us started by sharing some of the findings that you and other researchers there at the Federal Reserve have uncovered as you've studied these, what is happening in schools across Minnesota. I know that last year the Fed released a report that said Minnesota is one of the worst states in the country for education disparities. But I want you to share some numbers with us that really paint a picture of how students of different races are performing in school.
Sure. So as you said, that Minnesota has one of the largest disparities in the country, whether you look at it in terms of racial inequities or whether you look at it in terms of socioeconomic status. In terms of white black gap in test scores, we are the 50th in the nation or 49th, depending on which year you look at. And that has been persistent over time. So that's something that's very unique about Minnesota, because many states struggle with achievement gaps as well. But Minnesota has been struggling for a very long time, and we have been at the bottom persistently. This also we can see, whether you look at it in terms of test scores, whether you look at it in terms of college readiness, whether you look at it in terms of graduation rates. And going back to the question of, is it driven by whites doing much better than national average or blacks both doing better than national average? And the answer is no. If you look at grade 4 reading, whites do much better in Minnesota than just about the national average. However, blacks do much worse than the national average. So the gap is basically driven by our black students and other minority students doing worse than the national average. Going to graduation rates, it's been persistent over time. However, gaps are declining. Even though graduation rate gaps are declining, the college readiness indicators show us that there's been persistent gaps, right? So we are graduating more and more students, but they're not ready for college. In terms of numbers, the African-American students, had graduation rate over 35 a decade and a half ago. Now it's gone up to 67, but it's still much below the whites, which are doing much better in terms of the graduation rates. So those are some of the facts that came out in our initial analysis. The other thing that we see in the data is that it's not just in the terms of socioeconomic groups or racial groups, but also spatially, there's a huge disparity. So on an average, the rural areas and the school districts within rural and school districts within urban areas do as well. So the average is literally the same in test scores, as well as some of the graduation rates that we're seeing. The disparities are also pretty similar. So the bottom of the distribution, the worst school in rural areas is as bad as worst school in urban areas. The best school in urban area is as bad as the best school in rural area. So this fact was actually kind of surprising to us that, in education, you typically think of the problems facing rural areas as being different than problems in urban areas. But in terms of outcomes, we see the disparities as similar. Now, why they're different, there's a little bit difference between urban areas and rural areas, which I can go into later. But in terms of outcomes, they look very similar. The variation within schools and school districts are pretty similar. And the third thing I want to talk about is types of school types. And we see that, there's a notion that school districts in general do better. They might, charter schools do much worse on an average. But we find that the disparities between schools which are high minority population and low minority population is very similar, whether you look at within charter schools or whether you look at within public schools. So those are sort of the broad findings we have.
Now, I know that, that you talked about the unique thing about Minnesota is that there has not been any real reduction in these gaps for decades. Is that what stood out to you as a researcher?
Yes. And so states around the country some states have done better. Some states sort of, are doing worse, depending on how their demographics and how their school inputs are changing. But yes, the fact that it's high and it's so persistent is kind of surprising.
So, are there other metrics that we should be looking at that could paint a better picture of what is happening in schools? And I mean, are there other ways to measure academic success that we aren't using?
So there are various ways of looking at how well students are learning. The main way, of course, is looking at test scores that tells you how well the students are growing within the classroom. But we also have to look at our students showing up. So school attendance matters. There are a lot of families, especially in lower, struggling families where students just cannot go to school because of various reasons. So that's important. It's also important to understand the socioeconomic learning capabilities of students. Again, if there are a lot of disruptions in neighborhoods or disruptions in families, students' capacity to learn decreases as well. So we should be understanding and measure. So it's very hard to actually measure these things, but there have been, I know St. Paul Public Schools has been discussing these issues, Minneapolis Public Schools is discussing these issues. So it's very important to, one, understand how to measure it. That's the only way we can get a systematic understanding of who needs help in this area and who doesn't. The other aspect is also, what the peer effects are, how students are engaging with each other. Is there any, one of the aspects of learning in multicultural classrooms is how well students can integrate, right? And that's an important aspect that has to be looked into as well. So these are all the school level sort of outcomes, or also related to how the inputs are measured, but also in terms of, are there any help that is needed from a perspective of outside of classroom for students?
Mhm.
That's important to learn as well and keep an eye.
Finally, Anusha, I want to ask you, I know some people may wonder, like, why is the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis so interested in this issue of equity in education? And a few months ago, the Minneapolis Federal Reserve President, Neil Kashkari, announced that he and former Minnesota Supreme Court Justice Alan Page were leading an effort to change the state constitution, trying to get support for that. They're trying to get an amendment to the state constitution to address equity in education. So why does the Federal Reserve care about education and equity in education?
So the Federal Reserve, so first of all, I think when you think about how well an economy does, the labor force is a very important aspect of that. And a very important aspect of the labor force is the human capital that is developed. And human capital depends on the education that students get and also experiences that they have once they've completed school and college and so on. So one of the mandates of the Federal Reserve is maximum employment. And we do see, even in labor market outcomes, are huge disparities, and they
Mhm.
begin early on. And when we talk about school disparities, we also know that they start early, in early childhood. So early childhood intervention is as important as K-12 and so on. So there's a reason why Federal Reserve is studying these issues, and it has been for the last 15 years. We also had the early childhood model of Minnesota started with research at the Fed. And so it is important, in order to understand how to really have that, meet that mandate, what are the problems that exist in the education as well as labor markets.
Mm. All right. Anusha Nath there with the Federal Reserve, a research economist. Thank you so much for sort of setting the stage for us, giving us a sense of what we're dealing with. I want to turn to our other guests now, Jess, Ramona, Michael, Samantha. I know each of you is very passionate about this work. Before I get into the details of what you're specifically doing, each of you, I want to take a moment to hear from you what you have observed, what has happened since the pandemic came along and really exposed some of the disparities or this lack of equity in education the last few months. And Jess, I'll start with you. What are you seeing as a result of the pandemic?
It's a great question. And I think that we've talked about this a lot, that what we're seeing is this rise in consciousness about racial equity, that since the murder of George Floyd, it seems now that as a community, we are more in a place where we're ready to talk about it. We've had the data for years.
Mhm.
And so now is the time, if not now, when, as Representative Lewis has said, now is the time that we can move into the action and start making some real changes, because we know that there is a need. And I think the consensus has been that when we can go back to normal, whatever normal is, we cannot go back to the way it was before the pandemic and before this racial reckoning that we're seeing now.
Ramona, how has the pandemic changed the conversation about equity in education?
Well, I think we have revealed some layers, really, as far as the ideas of leadership in our school districts. Who is willing? I mean, I can't imagine beginning a school year at this point without a discussion about the murder of George Floyd and what happened in Minneapolis. And I think that these districts are really some are really showing their colors and their pushback, and even having a conversation about equity and inclusion and racism that is very apparent here in our state. I mean, you don't go 50 solid years as a state and fail Indigenous students, the Native students, and not do anything about it if that's not something, you know, very purposeful or
But, you know, Ramona, right now, a lot of classes are not in person. I mean, how do you have that conversation over Zoom with children?
well, I think there are many ways to have a conversation about race with kids is introducing, even in your very lessons, information about people who are different than you. And that in itself, at the very basic, we don't talk or celebrate Black and Brown and Indigenous people, even in our very basic curriculum. We don't even do that. We do it for a month. We choose a month, and you know, those histories are told during that month. But that is really our failure to explain diversity and the importance of the beauty of diversity to our Wakanyeja, and that's what we call our Native students. We call our children in our native language Wakanyeja. That means those sacred little ones. They're the most important. And if we grow them with an understanding of diversity and inclusion, and that is so integral to the strength of a community, then we're doing them an injustice.
Michael, let me ask you, since the pandemic has turned everything upside down, what has it revealed about the need for equity in education?
Well, I think first and foremost, you know, with the murdering of George Floyd that occurred in late May, you know, everybody's focus was on police brutality, and which the focus needed to be there. But now we have to focus on this educational brutality that has been going on. And I think people have shifted their focus on that, especially with all the data and everything that is going on. It's easy to see. It's just that maybe we
Michael,
haven't
let me
been
ask
paying
you,
that.
you said education brutality. Define that for me. What is that?
Well, that's basically what has been happening to our Black and Brown students throughout the time that we have had integration, right? We look at graduation rates, the test scores, the disproportionality of suspensions and referrals out of classroom. We have been brutalizing our Black and Brown babies for so long that they don't even feel connected to the schools. And some of that is what we're sharing. You asked the question about what can you do to kind of start this year off of these conversations off? Well, first we got to acknowledge what occurred throughout this summer and what was going on. If we don't start the year off in a way that centers what has happened in our space, specifically here in the Twin Cities metro area, we are doing a disservice because everybody is coming back on edge, and we have to, you know, de-escalate those feelings. And the way we do that is having those conversations. As educators, it's not that we have to have all the right answers. We just got to be willing to facilitate that conversation in the spaces, because we have to know that our babies got much more information than we can ever imagine if we allow them to bring it out.
Samantha, what are you seeing since the pandemic changed so much in all of our lives, but particularly with school children and teachers?
Well, we certainly saw the exacerbating of the gaps that existed for the past 20 years, as you know, Anusha had highlighted. And so, you know, as parents and children and families and communities are demanding more comprehensive and substantial action, we see folks more willing to listen at this point. We like to say, you know, we've made incremental progress, but that is nowhere near the need of what our families that's nowhere near what our families are asking for and what they deserve. And so I think that, as you know, the folks have said already, we're really paying attention now, and if not now, then when?
Okay. Now I want to hear more about what each of you is doing, and hear about what you're working on. And as far as equity in education, I want to know what is holding us back. Again, because we've had this data for a very long time. Each of you brings a very unique perspective to the conversation. Ramona, I'm going to start with you. Tell us more about the mission of We Are Still Here in Minnesota. I feel like the name says a lot about your organization.
I am the project director of We Are Still Here in Minnesota. We are still here in Minnesota. And the idea is that in 2016, we finally were able to get together some national research, and it's groundbreaking because it's not new to Native people, but it is to larger America. And this research shows that if we look at Native people, we are invisible, and then there's inaccurate representations of people. And that's across the media, which is crazy, pop culture, policy, governance, and basically it comes from K-12 education. So these damaging misperceptions about Native people, stereotypes, discrimination, all of this leads toward harmful narratives about who we are. So we are still here in Minnesota, is taking 4 very strong groups and creating some social capital. So philanthropy, pop culture, media, governance and policy, and K-12 education. And rather than siloing them, which is what we do in education, we don't kind of connect the dots and help children understand the big picture. So we are going to take all of these large organizations in Minnesota in these areas and work together to change the narrative, to tell an authentic story about Native people. One of the interesting things that came out of the data, this Reclaiming Native Truth, you can Google that, data is that 28 states do not mention Native people at all in their K-12 curriculum. And the ones that do, which includes Minnesota, do not discuss Native people after 1900. So there's the invisibility. It tells a child and a young developing mind that, hey, these people aren't here, they don't matter. And I think that's one of the resonating unsaid things that kids hear in school, is that if we don't talk about them, then they don't matter. And so rather than talk badly about them, and sometimes we just don't hear about the accurate histories, but it really helps a child to think, wow, they must not matter.
I'm curious about parents and within Indigenous communities. How do parents view the education that their children and teenagers are getting? What do they think about the schools that their kids are attending?
Well, I think I see every day parents who just throw up their hands and say, can you believe this homework? Can you believe the information that my children are learning in school? I think a lot of it is really, just exasperating, oh my God, here we are again. And for those of us who actually work, well, I don't anymore, but I did for 15 years in school districts, what is the answer to changing that narrative and creating, authentic narratives? There is state statutes that require teachers teach authentic Ojibwe and Dakota history. We need to make sure that teachers have the tools to do that. But we also should make sure that teachers don't get to update their licensure without aligning their curriculum to those state statutes. Mm-hmm. So say our doctors didn't upgrade their knowledge to maintain their licensure, it wouldn't be okay. And it's not okay for our teachers.
Thank you, Ramona. I want to get to Michael. Michael, you're with Minneapolis Public Schools. Tell us more about the Office of Black Student Achievement, why it was created, and what is it exactly that you and your staff do?
Yeah, for sure. I'll start off with our mission statement to kind of ground us. It goes, we exist to awaken the greatness within Black students in MPS, to have them determined to believe and achieve success as defined by their own values and dreams. And so that is exactly what we are accomplishing and attempting to do, right? And so a lot of our work is we designed a class called Black. It stands for Building Lives Acquiring Cultural Knowledge for our students to take, that is taught by Black educators, Black teachers. So we do that work, direct service with our students. And then we also do some professional development work with educators throughout our district on working on changing mindsets and beliefs of how we are perceiving our young Black and Brown students. And that really determines how the outcomes will be. If we perceive them a certain way, if we believe certain things about them, that's how we teach them, that's how we engage with them, which means we can have low expectations because our biases may be taken over in those areas. The other thing that we do is we try to be really good at authentically engaging with our families and communities, meaning getting out of our spaces, not expecting everyone to come to the schools to communicate and connect with us, but how do we get out into those community spaces and be part of the community, right? Creating that village that we talk about all the time and showing that we are partners in this, not that we have all the information, but how can you help us best support your child? We know that the families are the first teachers of our children. So how do we include them in this entire process? And so that's the work that we are centered around in our department. And so we stress that with everyone that we come in contact with.
So, what evidence is there that the work that you've been doing is making a difference?
Yeah, so we have done some propensity studies and some data to see what is happening since we've had the office around, and we have seen an increase in GPAs, increase in graduation rates for those students who have taken our Black class compared to Black students who haven't taken our class, and so there is a difference in that in those outcomes, and those who are taking our class have a better outcome. We also have done some work with educators, and so we've done some surveys around teachers and seeing where they are as they are on this journey. And so we are seeing that our workshops have benefited the teachers, at least that's what they share with us. And so that's always a positive thing. And we can see that schools that we have been in have also done better with Black students compared to schools that we're not in.
So, what do you see as potential solutions to this problem of racial inequity? Because again, the data has been around for a long time, and lots of different groups have tried to address it, but we're still stuck here at the bottom of the list.
For sure, for sure. And it's not just one answer to this question, right? So just want to make sure I share that out loud. But one thing that we can do is, again, centering narratives, right? How can we ensure that our curriculum is not just a Eurocentric curriculum, but it centers other epistemologies as well, so that we show that everybody is valuable, everybody has a worth, because we're sending two different messages in that classroom when we share only the Eurocentric narrative of what has happened in our society and in our country. We're sending that white folks have done this and created and mastered this, and everybody else is just kind of a part of it. They just been there, right? So that can create the inferiority complexes that we may see in some of our Black and Brown students based on what they have been teaching. The other thing is, it's about how do we have culturally responsive school leaders. I have Dr. Muhammad Khalifa as my advisor, and so we talk about this all the time, is the leader. What is the leader doing to push back against some of these systems of status quo that we see persist? And that takes a person that's willing to challenge the system, not necessarily worried about their job and their title, but really standing on behalf of the communities that they are serving. And one other piece that we have to do is be mindful of how do we bring those unfamiliar voices to the table. Too often we think as educators, we just have to make up all these decisions and figure out all these things out, but we have community members, we have students who have a great wealth of knowledge that they can help us decide and figure out what are some of these ills that they are facing. I just use that as the way that we start the Office of Black Male Student Achievement. I did 100 days of listening, and I intentionally went out and listened to Black males to find out what was needed, not what I thought was needed. Even though I'm a Black male, I wanted to hear from the 14, 15, 16-year-olds, what did they think was needed, and then deliver on that. So not only do we bring, and
What did they
I'm
say?
sorry.
What did they say, the 14 and 15-year-olds? What were they?
Well, a lot of it was I didn't feel like I was validated in school, so I didn't have connections with adults in the building. I don't know if I'm learning my true history in these spaces. And then also, I just want to have a safe space that I can just kind of be vulnerable and let my hair down, so to speak, so that I can be able to share what's been struggling with me throughout this time that I'm in the schools.
Samantha, I want to ask you about your work. You're with the Minnesota Council of Latino Affairs. What do you do as the legislative and policy director in education?
So the Minnesota Council on Latino Affairs, we are a state agency whose charge is to advise and inform the governor, state agencies, and the legislature on matters of that affect the Latino community. As a state agency, though, we also get to interface with community a lot and be able to serve as a liaison, an intermediary of sorts to the Latinx community. Telling them this is what's happening at the Capitol, this is how it could affect you. But specifically in the area of education, for the past year, we have shifted focus almost, and as Michael had mentioned, there's no one solution to solving the gaps that have persisted and exist, right? So in the area of education, we've been focusing on a comprehensive or holistic lens and how we're thinking about policy and how we approach our work. So early childhood education, addressing the achievement gap inside of the classroom, addressing the achievement gap outside of the classroom. So wraparound supports for families, what does that look like? And then also addressing barriers that exist for higher level education.
What do we know about how our Latinx students are doing? What are you hearing from parents? And is there any data you can share about how they're doing in terms of graduation rates?
So I'm not sure if Anisha had shared, but the state of Minnesota for Latinx students, this is one of the worst states in the country in terms of graduation rates and preparedness for a higher level education. So, you know, it's not great, but I think we're in a point where there's an opportunity to have honest conversations about what contributes to these disparities. There's incorporating parents into this discussion. There's so many assumptions as to our families are not engaged. Our parents are not paying attention, which is quite opposite of what exactly is happening with our families. They want to be engaged. They want to know what's going on with their child. They want to be able to support the parent, but they're not engaged in a meaningful and authentic way. And so better communications is not going to solve the issues, but it's certainly a start to better understand the child, better understand the needs, and develop trust that is so critical to learning.
So what do you think is missing from these students' experiences in schools, or, you know, what do you think that we could do right now that would make a dramatic change in how they are feeling about their education?
So from just a quick fix almost is better communication. Again, we make these assumptions as to, you know, language barriers, or folks are not paying attention to what's going on. We have a unique opportunity to reshape how we're engaging our families and utilizing their strengths and seeing them as an asset. One of the policies that we will be advocating for is an increase in EL funding, which hasn't been increased in 15 years. And so it's interesting because we value multilingualism for white students who learn a different language, but we don't place that same value on EL Latino kids who are English language learners. And so I think there needs to be a huge shift in how we, at a very fundamental level, see our students' assets and value what they bring to the table and value what our parents and families bring to the table.
Jess, I want to talk to you about your work. You are in a new school district now, in a new type of job this school year. You're working as a racial equity coach in St. Louis Park Public Schools rather than teaching math in the South St. Paul School District. Your job now involves working directly with teachers. So what are you doing with teachers?
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure it out, but it actually goes directly to what Samantha had just said about changing really the mindset of how we approach education, and that's with teachers. I think to answer your very initial question of what's holding us back, my job answers that. Adults hold us back. We get in our own way, and then we're asking students to solve these problems for us, and it shouldn't be their job to do that. So St. Louis Park has found this very creative way to use their funds towards teacher development, what was formerly QComp, now ATPPS. Most schools and most public schools have the program of doing peer observations, where I'm a teacher on a special assignment, and I will go into the classrooms of other teachers and just observe. And what St. Louis Park is doing differently is that they are using their peer observation teachers on special assignment to be specific about racial equity. And so in the district, there are a team of 9. I am one of 9 people for the entire district. And our job is to have conversations with teachers to build their will, skill, capacity, and knowledge towards becoming more culturally conscious, because the work starts within. If we don't start to really unpack how we have been navigating through whiteness, how we have been upholding this white supremacy, there's no way that we can create experiences for students of color that is going to make them want to come back to education as a career. So if we're looking at like what's one of the solutions, and students will tell you, well, it would be really great to have a teacher of color in front of me. Well, how do we do that when we create such horrible experiences that there's no student of color that wants to go back to it? So I'm really looking forward to having conversations with my caseload and getting to know the teachers, and just meeting them where they're at to figure out how they can better serve and create better experiences for their students.
What did you learn in the classroom as a math teacher? What do we know about, why certain students excel and why some, just need more time to get concepts down? Because I think most educators believe that every child can learn. It just requires different approaches. But I'm just curious, as a math teacher, what you saw.
Yeah, I hope that all teachers believe that. I hope that
Yeah.
teachers walk into the classroom and see the potential, and that every student is absolutely capable. What I learned as the only Black teacher in South St. Paul for almost a decade was that representation matters. If
In
you could,
in the high school, or you were
in
the
the
only Black teacher in the high school?
in the district
In the
for
district. Okay, we'll make sure I heard you right. Okay.
yeah, and then in specifically the high school as well, which was a 6 through 12 building. So um but what I learned was that representation matters, that I became the safe person for students to come to, because they knew that I could empathize with their experience when they were having a difficult time explaining their experience or feeling marginalized, that my lens was just different. I mean, if you can see it, you can be it. So um, we're not wrong. We need more teachers of color, but we have to create better experiences so that students want to become teachers.
All right, let's get to all these questions that are piling up that you all submitted online. I want to get our audience involved here, and I'll pick up on this theme of teachers. I have 2 questions here that are somewhat related. Saitul writes, in the era of Karens, please discuss the impact of the fact that 77% of teachers are white women. Also, another question that comes in, this is from Danielle, who identifies herself as a 7th grade teacher in Faribault. As a white female educator, as many of us in America are, how do I not just talk the talk, but walk the walk of an anti-racist education? So I'll start with you, Jess, as you work with teachers. So we have, far more teachers who are white than we have students of color, but the numbers, are growing. We're getting more and more diverse in our classrooms. And what would you say to this question of what do white teachers need to know, or what can they do to bring everybody where they need to be?
Right. Teachers need to be willing to start with themselves. They really need to start to hold up the mirror and look at the places that they potentially have marginalized students or other people of color. And it's really hard to crack open that book, White Supremacy and Me, and see all of the ways that maybe you've asked a student to code switch. I've had English teachers that have called it paycheck English. Well, what does that mean? Well, you want me to speak white. Just things that we don't ever really think about, because we live in this world of whiteness, and we have to understand how we operate within it so that we can understand how we're asking our students to operate within it. And that's hard. That's really hard work. So before teachers can even turn it around and go, what can I do to help a student? It's not about saving the students. Students are going to be fine. It's about liberating them. And in order to do that, you need to know where the work is, and it starts with you. And again, looking forward to having those conversations with adults.
Samantha, what would you say to these questions about the majority of teachers being white?
So 4% of the state's licensed teacher workforce are teachers of color or indigenous teacher. 34% of the student population is children of color or indigenous children. So there's like, that's the context of where we're at in the state of Minnesota, and it's been like that for years. And so policy that we have been in partnership with the Coalition to Increase Teachers of Color calls for not only substantial funding to not only recruit and hire teachers of color, but it's also, we need to start retaining them. We are producing more teachers of color, but showing no significant increase shows that we're not retaining them. And so in addition to the funding that does need to be able to support that, our bill would call for significant policy change. So it's not only just the teacher, but the districts and charter schools would be required to set an environment that validates, affirms, and embraces all students and teachers, so that the learning and work environment is more conducive and more welcoming to learning and working within those respective schools and districts.
Michael, there with Minneapolis Public Schools, what would you say to white teachers who want to know what can they do that maybe they're not doing to address equity in education?
Yeah, well, obviously, the first thing is, how do I stand up, right? How do I stand up when I see things that are happening that are not appropriate, right? And that is a difficult thing to do. I think Jess has mentioned it. It's the great Frantz Fanon talks about, before I can decolonize somebody else, I got to decolonize myself. So how do I do that internal work first? That's first and foremost. And then as I start to see how I'm doing, now I can start to recognize where some of those disparities or those inequities are happening, and now I can address those. What I will share with people is that not only is it hard, it's also, you're not going to be correct if you're going to say the right words or the right terms at the time. And so you have to get that practice. And so you got to practice it, start small, making those steps, making those statements, and then you can get better at it. Because I'll say, the person that you see sitting in front of you right now is not the same Michael Walker that you saw 8-9 years ago, but I've had a lot of practice of standing my ground and facing different things, and now I'm better at it. On the other piece about the recruitment and retention of teachers of color, I think Jess kind of nailed it, but I just want to make sure I reiterate this, is that we have the luxury of having students in our system for 13 years. We have to do a better job of recruiting them while they're in our system, which first starts off with getting them a better experience, right? So how do we make sure they have a better experience going through our system as Black and brown students, so they want to become an educator later in the future? The second thing that we can do that is very small is, how often, or has anyone told a Black or brown student, hey, you know what, you'll be a great teacher when you grow up? If we don't do those small little simple things, trying to recruit them when they're 25 and 30 is not really a thing. We have to do it when they're babies and when they're young and they get the experience, and we show them the greatness that they can be by asking them those targeted questions.
Let me ask you this other question, Michael, while I have you here. Aaron writes, what can teachers do when their district is less than supportive? So you got a teacher out there who's ready to fight the fight, but it's not getting support from a principal or from the superintendent.
Yeah, that's the hard. I mean, that's the hard part of it. Like, as you start to do this work, you'll start to notice that you will maybe get singled out, and challenging the status quo can be scary, right? It can be scary. It may put you at risk, but we have to understand that our students don't have the privilege to opt out. Right. So as adults, we have the privilege to opt out if we choose to, but our babies don't. So to me, it's not an option of opting out. I have to say something. I have to speak on it. And knowing that it puts me at risk, I try to build coalitions with other educators within our organization, so that now they can't just pinpoint and say, well, Michael Walker is the issue. No, it's a collective of us who are also going through this at the same way and same pace. So that's kind of how I try to approach that. So I would suggest this person to find a coalition of other educators who are like-minded and trying to push for the same thing, so they can't just single that one person out.
Another question here. Molly in Minneapolis wants to know, how do we foster an environment where kids feel safe to share what they witnessed if they witness an act of racism. And teachers feel comfortable reporting it to higher ups. Ramona, do you want to weigh in on that?
I think we have to establish an environment of trust. I think we have, my experience has been in Indian education and then teacher training. So I've kind of been able to do both. Understanding that American has this value system, America, that says if you admit that you're weak, if you admit that you don't know something, that you're weak. And we also have a hierarchy in the school system. So the first thing we need to do is come to terms with that and be able to say, you know what, I don't know everything. So when I speak with teachers and talk about aligning this authentic curriculum, ask your students, ask what they think. Say, you know what, I don't know this. I wasn't raised to know this, and create a conversation and develop trust. I tell you, I have seen some real ugly things in the hallways with the way kids are treated in school districts, because there's this feeling that you just have to control them, and kids they're so beautiful. We don't do that in our houses with our own kids, because we know what they're going through. They're letting off steam or whatever. So I feel like each teacher has to be able to create an air of trust and say, you know what, I don't know. Be humble, learn with them, ask them, this is the bottom line. This is what I want you to learn. Let's look at resources. Am I teaching you that? Look at the books. Is this telling you this, or is this giving you some other understanding? I mean, it has to be like a whole recreation of what teaching and learning is. One of the things is teaching to the test. Teachers are teachers. We don't teach for the money. I don't know any teacher that does it for the paycheck, because we're so overworked. We teach care about kids, and we don't do it wrong on purpose. And so we have to be humble. We have to be create really trusting environments for students.
Jess, would you add anything to that? The question has to do, how do you create an environment that a child feels safe, a student feels safe if they've witnessed or seen something or something's not right, that they can report it?
Yeah, I think you model it. You have to be brave. I mean, what's the cost of not doing the work, right? We cannot go back to the way it was. And so you model that vulnerability. You model those conversations, and it will be tough, like Michael had said, and sometimes you're going to feel alone. But I do want to offer, again, I was the only Black teacher in an entire district for almost a decade. We've been alone. So I need my white allies to step up and transition into an accomplice and a co-conspirator, because again, if not now, when?
A question from Jennifer. She writes, are there initiatives happening in greater Minnesota where diversity has steadily increased, and yet school efforts are lagging in terms of addressing racial inequities and the achievement gap? And Samantha, I know you do work statewide with the Minnesota Council on Latino Affairs. In greater Minnesota, what are you finding in terms of the populations there, and what's happening in the schools as they're changing in a lot of these communities?
We actually, over the course of this past summer, we were actively in conversations with various Latinx groups in Greater Minnesota, gauging them as to like what their experience is, particularly after the pandemic, as community really does serve as the foundation for how we set our policy agenda and how we think about what policies we're going to be pushing forward. But in saying that, I think it was pretty sobering, quite candidly. Parents through the distance learning period were on a spectrum of feeling quite candidly abandoned, and then or issues with technology. The expectations that we give you technology or hotspots, and you're supposed to immediately know how to navigate through those. So I think there's still some frustration as to how the beginning of this school year has shaped out. But I think again, it seems simple sometimes, but the relationship between a school, a teacher, an administrator with families is critical um, to understand what the child and what the family experience is. And I think, we in Minnesota like to assume that local districts and charter schools know how to serve their student best. But I think, some of that is a flawed thinking when we don't have administrators, particularly in greater Minnesota, that look like our kids. We don't have school board members that look like our kids. We don't have teachers or support staff that look like our kids. And so all of that contributes to the experience that our children are having. And so we still have a ways to go.
We have a question here that was submitted through a video. So we're going to see if we can play this video, and then I'll have you guys respond to it. We heard from Derek Francis, who is the Manager of Counseling Services for the Office of College and Career Readiness for Minneapolis Public Schools. And he has a question about, or a comment he has about what he thinks is lacking in terms of teacher training. And let's see if we can play that video right now.
Disparities in education system has really been around educator training gap. There's a lot of educators that have their degrees in teaching or school counseling or social work, but they haven't really done a deep dive into understand how race, privilege, bias impacts their work with students. And so what that means is students are able to experience a lot of that bias from teachers and counselors, whether it's microaggressions that are said by the staff, or maybe in the practice of who are you inviting to take higher level classes. And so I know sometimes it can be uncomfortable for teachers to address those gaps in their learning, but it's really important. And I've seen how there's been a lack of responding to incidents. Maybe it's racial incidents, maybe even George Floyd that just happened in schools. So a lot of my work now has been around helping give educators a chance to learn those skills, to have conversations with students around race and bias and microaggressions, and uplift them to know how to call those things out, but then also help the educator realize some of their practices that they need to work on so they can better support all students. Thanks.
So that's Derek Francis there. So he is talking about actually a gap in educator training, a training gap with teachers. Jessica, let me ask you, what do you think about that?
I think he's right on. And I think that the role that I'm playing now in St. Louis Park Schools as a racial equity instructional coach is part of the solution. If I could draw a parallel between Kendi's metaphor
Professor
that he used.
Ibram X. Kendi, yes.
Yes, thank you. And I got to see your conversation last week, and I really appreciate him as a colon cancer survivor, drawing this parallel between cancer and racism as a cancer in our society. And having been diagnosed with breast cancer this summer myself, it just resonated on a much deeper level. And Professor Kendi says that racism is a cancer of our society and therefore should perhaps be treated in the same way that we treat cancer. And it's a combination of surgery where you go in and take out the most damaging and dangerous part, chemotherapy where you flush the entire system out, and then radiation where you need to touch up those spots. And I was trying to figure out where my role as a racial equity instructional coach was. And I've decided, now that I have my own experience with this whole process, that I really think that my role is the pre-meds that I have to take before chemo to kind of help me not be nauseous before and after chemo. I really think that we can tap in to the collective whole. We've got so many skills and knowledge and incredible people out there that we can support each other, and teachers can support one another in this journey. And so I can go in and help make the experience of that chemo a little bit more tolerable for other teachers so they don't get nauseous.
I understand the analogy completely. Let's see, Ramona, what do you think about a training gap? Is there a teacher training gap that's playing a role in equity in education and affecting how the students are performing?
Absolutely. That's what I meant when I said teachers really need tools. They need to be able to understand what it looks like. What does it look like for a child to feel microaggression in class? What is a microaggression? How many times does it happen to a student? And when we have these initial talks about race um, with teachers, they don't ever have to have the conversation. If you're a white person, you could essentially live your whole life and be able to divert away from conversations about race if you want to. As a even a lovely young little person in school, they have to navigate two worlds. And that is like splitting that identity and being able to walk in this world. Like for Native people is understanding your own knowledge, your own sense of place, your language, all of these things that you don't get at school, but then also be able to turn that off and walk in this other world. So our students actually socially can navigate these two ways. So we have to be able to help teachers exercise the muscle. And Michael was saying, you grow a vocabulary in order to do this. And teachers need to humble themselves, put themselves in those difficult, hard situations at first. And it does get easier. It's a conversation, but it has to be had. And I would have to say, our teachers are 97% white women. I've never heard the 70 figure.
That could be nationally, perhaps. Michael Walker, is there a teacher training gap? And do your students share stories with you about microaggressions that they have experienced?
Well, yeah, first, our classroom is designed for that, to be able to come in and share those experiences that they're having so that they can be able to figure out how to navigate them. So we kind of do that in our space right off the bat. As far as the training gap, I think we have to look at, well, what are our colleges and institutions providing our teachers that are coming through the pipeline, right? So how are they preparing them? And so we have to go back and look at that system and say, so what are they doing in that system to prepare them to work with diverse populations, to see the inequalities and injustices that are approaching, that we're seeing in education, also about, or even around curriculum, what are we teaching them to teach when they get into the K-12 system. And so all those things have to be addressed. And so some of that does fall on the institutions that are preparing the teachers. And then once they come to the school systems, right, that they are in, then there should be some more direct specific teaching or training, if you want to use that term, that can help them in the classroom as they start to figure out where they're doing in their system specifically, if that makes sense, what I'm saying.
Samantha, anything you want to add about what may be missing in teacher training? What could be helpful that would help teachers have a better understanding of what some of their students are experiencing?
I mean, like teacher, like training on the front end?
Yeah, I guess like while they're in college, but also, I think the training continues on after even you've had experience in the classroom.
Yeah. So I go back to the policy and like in our Teachers of Color bill. So the districts and charter schools need to be able to provide their teachers with the fundamentals in terms of having these difficult conversations. And it's important that our teachers, our educators understand that our parents are yearning to be helpful in their child's educational success. And so opening lines of communications with parents and utilizing the parents' knowledge and the parents' strengths it just leads to ultimate success for their child.
I have a question here from, give me a second here. I misplaced it. From Monica. Monica writes, as an empty nester, the data shared is shocking to me. What can an empty nester do to close the gap for Brown and Black students? So I think we have a lot of community members who their kids may be grown and have gone on. They may be grandparents at this point, but people care about children and making sure that all kids get a quality education. So community members who want to do something that could have some type of an impact. Any ideas, any advice on what they can do to help? Samantha, I have you there. What would you suggest to community members, or in this case, particularly an empty nester who may have just some time?
So this is actually an interesting question. So I will start with communities of color. We have been providing the answer. We've been providing suggestions, solutions in terms of how do we better serve our children. And so one, we need to start listening, right? And then two, though, we really do need our white allies, our white parents, our white policymakers to see this achievement gap and the opportunity gaps as a Minnesota problem. If we don't make intentional investments into addressing these gaps, what does that mean for, Nusha mentioned it, what does that mean for the Minnesota economy? What does that mean for our competitiveness? What does that mean for our future workforce? So I think the advocacy around talking to folks, talking to board members, talking to legislators, talking to superintendents, those are a critical piece in terms of capitalizing the conversations and the dialogue that have really transpired over the past year or so.
Jess, what would you say to Monica, who wants to know, as an empty nester, what can she do on the outside to try to help?
Vote. Straight up vote. I mean, it's vote yes for the levies. Push back on things like tax equalization. My partner is a firefighter, and we have this conversation all the time about if their department needs a new truck or a new building, they don't have to go and knock on the doors of the residents to ask for that. Yet I, as a teacher, need to do that when we need new smart boards and whatnot. Go out and vote, and vote in the little stuff. Know who your school board is. Know who your commissioners are. All of that absolutely matters. And then talk about it with people so that it becomes the norm. This is all about us doing this together and collectively, and just consider what we could be if we actually worked as a unity as a team.
Mm. Michael, what would you say to our community member who wants to do something, who's paying attention, or actually she said she's shocked to learn just how difficult and how bad things are?
Yeah, I'll just try to sum it up in a quick little statement is first, we have to realize that it's not that we need to fix Black and brown students, right? We need to fix the system in which they have to engage within. And so some of that work is how are they holding the system accountable for this population of students that has not been treated well within the system. And so again, I think Jess and Samantha have stated it perfectly. Advocacy of going into board meetings and school board meetings and showing up at schools, volunteering some of your time and sharing your expertise, being a real model to the students so they can see who is in our community and what they are doing in our community so they know that they can reach that goal. So those are just a few little things.
Mm-hmm. Ramona, any suggestions for our empty nester?
I liked the vote. I say, yeah, vote. Say yes to those referendums. Support schools.
I have a question here from Kristen, who says, I'm a teacher in St. Paul and a parent advocate in Hudson, Wisconsin. What points can I bring to a school board in Wisconsin to engage them in serious discussion regarding racial equity? So our folks who are trying to get school boards to actually listen and take some new approaches to doing things as equity is involved. What would you take to a school board meeting? What could you say to a school board that you feel is just not paying attention and is not doing what it can? Samantha?
I think starting with being honest and clear I think just being honest and clear with personal experiences and stories that you can bring to the table, because it's hard to hear the truth when it's ugly, right? So without knowing the context in Hudson, Wisconsin, but what is the sentiment on the ground? What are parents, what are students, what are they feeling in terms of the environment in that respective school district? So being able to communicate those to the school board, and just being unapologetic about where things are at.
Any other advice if you were going to a school board to make a presentation? What might you say, Michael Walker?
Well, I think Jess kind of said it, and I think Ramona also said it. Hey, the power is the vote, right? They work for us, and so if they're not addressing the concerns that we have, then we vote them out. And we're saying, hey, if you're not doing your job around this racial equity, well, we don't want you on our school board because you're not doing what we're saying that we need for our students, for our families, for our community. And so we have to use our power in voting. And so now we get somebody else in that space that will stand up and do that work.
This is a question from Lynette. She writes, my daughter is Black and attends a mostly white middle school in the East Metro. When I asked her if she discussed George Floyd in any of her classes, she said no. What can I do as a parent to bring this to the attention of administration? And we touched on this. I mean, the fact that right now a lot of school districts are, in full distance learning, maybe hybrid learning. It may be difficult to have some of these conversations or maybe not, but by not having conversations about what is happening in terms of the push for racial equity and to, new ways of approaching racial injustice, by not talking about it, like what is that doing to students? Because students are talking about it, right? Right, Jess?
Absolutely. By not talking about it, it's murdering their spirit. It's what Ramona had said earlier of that invisibility. If we don't talk about it, then it doesn't matter. Bring your truth and bring all of it. It's personal, local, and immediate. This is what's happening right now, and it is affecting all of us.
Is it a distraction to learning for a child? Because if they've got questions about like what's happening outside of their home or what's happening in their community and they can't talk about it, does it create a distraction for learning, math or these other classes that they're told like you need to do this?
Sure, but it's learning can't happen until all the basic needs have been met. So that's why the Black Panthers fed our babies and where we get our breakfast programs from. We need to create safe places for kids to have these conversations, but learning isn't going to happen until we get all of the rest of that out of the way. And if we're not paying attention to their social emotional well-being, then it's hard for me to argue that we need to learn the quadratic formula.
Samantha, what do you say about schools or teachers who are choosing not to address some of the social issues that are happening right now?
Quite frankly, it's unacceptable, right? Given after the murder of George Floyd and what has happened in our states, in our country over the past several months. How are you going to get a student to trust you? How are you going to get a student to engage with you if you're ignoring their reality? So quite frankly, it's just unacceptable.
Ramona, if we don't talk about social issues, what happens to a student who has questions?
Well, I think the pushback is the teacher not being able to have that conversation because, like I say, they haven't developed the terminology, the vocabulary to have that conversation. But be assured that that child is all over social media and having that conversation. Again, humble yourself. Use it as a way of being able to have a safe conversation in your classroom and just connecting with that beautiful Wakaija. Asking, these are 3 examples of things in the media. Turn on some critical thinking skills. Talk about different ways of understanding a situation and what's happening in your community. I don't understand how that can't be happening first and foremost, but I have heard some conversations of schools going back and whether or not they were going to include that conversation. And I really feel like there's a fear about not admitting, I don't know that, Leadership is everyone in the community. And if you don't have that vocabulary, someone else does.
Michael Walker, Lynette is asking, what can I do as a parent to bring this to the attention of administration? So how do you handle that as a parent if you just don't agree with how a teacher or a school is dealing with this right now?
Well, again, you're the first advocate for your child, so definitely speak up and go through the proper channels. So reach out to the administrator in that building if you're not getting your needs met, and stand up for your children. The other piece I want to add on the first kind of question that you're talking about, how can educators, have that space in their classroom, is that, well, first they got to build these relationships with students, right? It's really important to build the relationship with the students so you can have those conversations. We also have to be mindful that educators are very good at posing questions, right? So we know how to have deeper level questions that we may not necessarily know the answer to, but we can provide that space for students to think through them. So we can ask questions about the murdering of George Floyd and how that impacted them in their own local and immediate, and then we can spread it out to how did it impact their neighborhood, then how did it impact the city of Minneapolis, then how does that impact our nation, right? So now students can have those type of conversations, and I don't have to be the expert on all those racial things. What we have to be really aware of is that Black and brown students, by the time they're in high school, they probably got a master's degree in race.
Yeah.
And they may be having a teacher who, specifically talking about our white teachers, who have not talked about race much of their life, have a first or second grade understanding of race. And so now that's where some of that anxiety and nervousness come in about wanting to facilitate that conversation, when all you have to do is just allow the babies to lead. They know if you lead with grace and you show your vulnerabilities, the students will allow you to have that space. They'll help you grow and learn just like you do for them when they're learning your subject matter area. That's how we make this learning a two-way street, and we build upon each other, not this individualistic system, but a collective system.
And Michael, while I have you here, I want to share a question and pose this to you from a student. This is Victoria. Victoria writes, I am a student. What can students who are advocating for equity do to make teachers and administrators who aren't listening listen? What can students do? What advice would you have to the students themselves about their own power?
Yeah, first I would say always organize, right? Organize, get more voices, more perspectives at the table, and then find some adult allies that can also be a voice for you in certain meetings that you may not be privy to, so that they can speak on your behalf in those spaces to try to get some of that change. And as you start to see what is occurring, then you might have to step up your level of work, right? So I may have won this notch, I didn't see any change. Now I got to go to the next level of what needs to happen to get change. And we have to realize that they're young people, right? So they're not going to have all the things figured out. They're not going to be 15 steps down the road. Sometimes we expect them to have it all figured out of why I'm protesting or why I'm doing this. Well, they're 15, 16 years old. They're still developing. This is supposed to be education, a place where they can learn and grow. So let's give them that space and let's help them figure out how to do that versus trying to shut it down and knock it down.
And Jess, I'll give you the final word of the evening. As a former Minnesota Teacher of the Year, a student is asking, what can they do as a student to be heard as we have these discussions about the quality of the education that they're getting?
I don't know that I can actually answer any better than Michael Walker did. I organize and find that adult advocate to help you navigate that system. So I think what I will leave you with then is just to consider, how do we do this work interdependently, so that this work is for the collective good. Let me leave you with a quote from Grace Lee Boggs, who said, activism is the journey rather than the arrival.
All right. Thank you. Thank you to all of our guests. Our time is up. Thank you to all of our listeners and all the great questions that you submitted. Our guest again, Michael Walker, Director of Black Student Achievement for Minneapolis Public Schools, Ramona Keto Stately, Indigenous Culture and Language Educator and Activist with We Are Still Here, Minnesota, Samantha Diaz, a Legislative and Policy Director in Education at the Minnesota Council on Latino Affairs. Thank you, Samantha. And Jess Davis, Racial Equity Coach for St. Louis Park Public Schools and a former Minnesota Teacher of the Year. And earlier in the conversation, I want to thank again, we heard from Anusha Nath, a research economist with the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. Thank you, Anusha, for getting us all started. And I want to let everyone know that if you missed part of the conversation or want to encourage somebody else to listen to this, we will be airing a recording of this discussion on NPR News tomorrow morning at 11. And if you're registered for tonight's event, you'll also receive a survey to tell us what you thought about it, because we're going to continue to have events like this. Education's a frequent topic on my talk show at 11 a.m. Each weekday here on NPR. You can search for the podcast. It's NPR News with Angela Davis. And there you'll find some of my previous talk shows where we talk about the shortage of teachers of color. We've talked about learning loss, the coronavirus slide. We talk a lot about the mental health of students, teachers, and parents as well. And the video of this virtual event and other In Focus events about racial disparities in Minnesota can be found at this website. It's nprnews.org/ground level. Have a good night, everyone. And thank you on behalf of NPR News for joining us tonight.